the great contemporary photographer. And this meeting is a part of the series that we have here at the museum that's called Fotografia and Conflict. And this is the second meeting that will be held by Krzysztof Pijarski. Thank you, Krzysztof, for being here today with us. And I have to mention that this meeting and this project is financed by European Union, Next Generation EU. So thank you for that. And so we have maximum 2 hours for everything. So dear guests, please welcome Susan and Krzysztof.
One, two. Hello, everybody. My name is Krzysztof Pijarski, and it is my honor to introduce to you Susan Meiselas, who has been my hero. Yes, I must say that because heroine, actually, yes, exactly, for many years, and in many respects, this conversation will be about why. And I've been teaching photography for many years now, like more than 15, I think. And your work has always been very important in the curriculum as a kind of exemplary practice. So I'm really honored to be here with you. And so to introduce Susan, I don't think she needs very much of an introduction, but it is an important part, an important courtesy. So here you go. Susan is a documentary photographer based in New York, member of Magnum since 1980, and now head of the Magnum Foundation since 2007, with a mission to expand diversity and creativity in documentary photography. This is the mission statement under which you operate. And the project that propelled Susan into Magnum was Carnival Strippers, an amazing documentary piece about strippers in American carnivals, from a very intimate perspective of, I don't know, closeness with the protagonists of the piece. And she is known for her documentation of human rights issues in Latin America, Kurdistan, and other fragile contexts. So we are going to talk mainly about her work in Nicaragua from the 70s, but which spans until today, actually. So this is also one of the aspects we're going to talk about. Other notable documentary projects of Susan's are Pandora's Box, Encounters with the Dani, Prince Street Girls, about a group of young women from New York City, which you also took in the 70s, and then it was presented as a book in 2016, I think. A Room of Their Own, which is about domestic violence. And she is also the recipient of the MacArthur so-called Genius Grant and a Guggenheim Fellowship. She's the first woman she got the First Woman in Motion Award at the Rencontre d'Arles in 2019. The Deutsche Börse Photography Foundation Prize, also in 2019, and the Erich Salomon Award of the German Society for Photography in 2022. So that's a lot of acknowledgements for your work. And what might be also of importance is Mediations, a retrospective exhibition that has toured the world starting at Jeu de Paume a couple of years ago. I was happy to be able to see it in Riga some time ago. In Ljubljana, not Riga, yes, of course. I mixed it up, yes, in Ljubljana, definitely. And so that was like a big retrospective that pulled all your projects together in one place and really contextualized them. So I think this is all I can say in the beginning. One word of commentary which I really would like to ask you about is Ariela Azoulay, when speaking about your practice, she said that it's about unlearning the position of a photographer as an expert. What do you think about that?
Maybe the perfect place to begin. Yeah. First of all, it's amazing to be here. Truly, in less than 2 days, to assimilate so much history, so much pain, to reconcile the past in your own present lives, because we're all living with what surrounds us on our iPhones, even if we're distant. We can't be distant, we can't forget, we can't not know. And what will we remember, right? So it's quite something to be here. It's also hard for me to go back to time long ago. I think when we had a very quick Zoom call, and I was trying to think what's of interest to people really now about times past, how you deal with time as a photographer, how you come to be who you become, in a sense. I didn't choose war, and so I think even though this title is there, it's a curious one for me. I wanted to start here because I think this is very hard for people to believe, but I feel today it could be the same, a kind of a headline of a place I had no knowledge of, even though the US had a long history supporting the Somoza regime, 50 years of a family rule. So what we know, when we learn, when we are ready to learn. I mean, Ariella says unlearn, but you have to learn to what unlearn, or to relearn, or to rethink. So this is what I saw in January 1978. It took me almost 6 months to go to Nicaragua, and I think that's sometimes you feel spontaneously something, but you're not ready yet to move. And I think this whole question of, as a photographer, it's all about moving your body, placing yourself someplace and in time. So this is an important starting point. I think what I wanted to do in this conversation, it's not so much about me as much about photographs, making of photographs, the way photographs then once made have lives of their own. So that's kind of the arch of what we're going to talk about. This is Somoza opening the Congress. I was the only foreign photographer, and I really had never, I had no sense of really when I landed, how long I would stay. I never imagined I'd be going back as often as I came to do. I think something about documentary practice that's important is this act of faith, that you're seeing something, you don't really know how it will be seen by others. It's first your encounter. So as an American, it's important that I had access. How do you have access as an American to the Somoza troops, etc.? But the more critical question was how to become a trusted observer. So less about access and more about how you read the culture. So, ¿Dónde está Norma Gonzalez? The dictatorship must answer. Behind the white paint is another consigna, what would have been like a public calling. So the graffiti is trying to speak to people about what's happening that they can't see. And of course, I can't see. So I read about something known as the disappeared, which I've read about in Chile and Argentina, but I'm in Nicaragua. And I think that calling out is part of what propels me to stay.
But also when you spoke about what brought you there, that it was in the end. I mean, you just said it took you 6 months, but still, when you recounted that experience, that you didn't know very much about the context. You just went there. You didn't speak Spanish. You You had this kind of feeling that it's important to be there.
Yeah.
And then this was the photograph, no?
And
Which
well-
was one of the moments when it opened up the
It
context
opens,
for you.
Yeah, it opens up the who am I? Partly, how do you tell the moment that the moments that I'd lived before as a student in '68 led me to be comfortable in this kind of setting. This is a moment just after 4 students had been killed in the town of Hinatepe. And as they walk through the town carrying the coffins, they pass the home of a young woman named Arlen Sue. And her parents take the photograph that's on their living room wall out to be carried with them. She had been killed in the mountains several years before. So what we're seeing, I'm seeing, not knowing who she is, not knowing why she's being held at that moment. But what they also, and in the film that I do later that maybe you're referring to, which I'll tell you about in a minute, but someone confronts me with a bullet that's made in the USA. So I'm very aware of being an outsider. And yes, I don't have language initially, but I'm really acutely aware of how to move across a relatively small landscape. It's not as big as Poland. Nicaragua was, I could go from place to place relatively quickly. I'm learning where to go by listening to the radio and hearing what people are talking about. I'm traveling alone at this period. I think the important thing is this idea of where you place yourself, where you develop a sense that it's important to be present. So I'm near a kind of, the military are not looking at me, they're going house to house doing a search for weapons. But I remember that anxiety, let's say, of just how they might understand or see me seeing them, so that I'm learning to place myself and yet not be the object of their, not targeting me, as it were. It's funny, I've forgotten the sequence, and of course this is a picture which is quite important because I begin to see them pulling the police, and this was the National Guard, pulling people off of a bus, interrogating them, checking out what they had in their pockets, what they might be carrying, assuming that they might be aligned with the underground movement known as the Sandinistas at that time. I'm in a car separately and able to take one photograph before I'm free to go forward. So I think these moments in which you're present and yet you have to judge how long you can stay, how long you can see, or make an image of what you think you're seeing. I'm learning as I'm going. The work on Carnival Strippers is a completely different body of work where I become more and more intimate. This is a situation where each day is unpredictable, and I'm just moving. This is a difficult image for you all to see, but was really, I think, the essential image for me to kind of acknowledge that I was from a place where I could not possibly have imagined something like this happening. So the National Guard or the police would pull someone out of their home, something that, of course, you know the histories here. This was a site of execution on the top of a hill about a mile out of the capital, Managua. And down the hill there were parts of other bodies. I could literally take one frame in black and white and one frame in color and move on for total fear that I would be seen. And this is sort of the relationship between evidence, you know. If you hold the evidence, you are responsible, you're complicit. So that the strongest memory of making this image is capturing what I had heard about but had never seen. Once I see it, it's what do I do with it, right? I think I'm not yet at a place where I've ever worked with the media. I'm still documenting on my own for a period of 6 months. 6 weeks before I returned to New York. So I'm not seeing these photographs. You have to remember we're in an analog time. So this is Kodachrome. I wouldn't have seen this photograph until several weeks later. So I'm working in a kind of blind space, connecting every day to different parts of what's happening in the country. Oops. This is, in a way, a turning point, because I come back after 6 weeks, and by coincidence, really, I'm the only person that had the photographs from Nicaragua at the time that a writer from the New York Times Magazine wants to do a major piece about what he calls the national mutiny in Nicaragua, but it's really an uprising. The photograph that's on the cover is quite important, because in part of my work at that time was working with local photographers and local journalists. And by the time I'm there, several weeks, one of them takes me to this part of the forest that's surrounding a very small town called Masaya. And they're practicing jumping out of the trees with Molotov cocktails that they've made at home. And of course, hidden from everyone. So that was sort of, when I talk about being a trusted observer, it's sort of the moment that I'm as close as I can be as an outsider to a very inside situation, but with the knowledge that's quite dangerous to also hold. I don't see them. I don't see their faces, which is important. They perform themselves for me, and I've often thought that they knew better what they were doing than I understood. And then, of course, when it becomes the cover of the New York Times Magazine, it's a real proclamation of their power at that moment.
It's also very symbolic, because they have the Sandino masks, no?
They're wearing folklore masks that celebrated the indigenous history in Nicaragua. But this tension...
Those pictures went around the world, because they were shown in Geo, in Japanese journals.
And that's kind of what begins to happen. I mean, part of the way I organized this was to give you a feeling for how I'm beginning to make the photographs, but who I'm making them with, right? I'm not making them for the media. I'm making them with people in a strange way. I become part of... this is a story that's in the local newspaper, the same one where the opposition newspaper editor Chamorro had been killed. His son goes on to lead the paper, and so as my work gets published in Geo magazine, they publish that they're being seen in Geo magazine, which is kind of interesting. Again, this is so far before this is 1978, long before the internet, where everything is simultaneous. So you have to imagine that for them, they're seeing a magazine that's being published in Germany, that they're being featured in through the work that I've done.
And could you speak a little bit more about your relationship with La Prensa? Because it's also important in this context, no?
Well, La Prensa, it's the journalists with La Prensa that bring me to the photograph I just showed you with the Molotov cocktails. La Prensa later becomes very important when it gets bombed. Mm-hmm. I think I'll maybe tell that in a minute. Mm-hmm. I think the other thing that I've been a lot thinking about even today, I mean, this is a very particular war in Central America. It's not like Vietnam, where there was North and South. It's not like the Ukraine, which are on one side or the other, or even if we think about what's happening in the Middle East, who is reporting from Gaza. It's very specific. This is a time where there are no front lines. It's constantly moving, and you're constantly moving, not knowing if you'll be with, in this case, the Somoza troops or with the guerrillas. So it's a very particular kind of dynamic. As you can see, I'm now in a very different town. I'm working again with 2 cameras, so the black and white photographs in this period of 78, 79, black and white could be transmitted quickly. Color had to be shipped or carried out of Nicaragua to be processed. But I think what the thread of thinking is really on my end is trying to figure out how to be as many places to see, to constantly move. Somoza destroys one of 5 major towns in Nicaragua at that time, which mobilizes, of course, the whole population against him, or a large part of the population. And this is the image that then I learn the most from, in a way. This is a photograph made on the day before Somoza leaves the country. It's the last gesture, in a way, a defiant act. He becomes known as the Molotov Man. And so I think in trying to share part of this legacy, I really wanted to give you a feeling of not only, so you make photographs, some of them are published, you come back and you have piles and piles around you, and then the making of the book was a feeling like they had to have a home. All of the work had been dispersed, it had been fragmented, it had been directed by other people's headlines. So then what do you do when you come back? What do you do with this work? And it had to be bicultural. It had to be a project that was going to read to the Nicaraguans as much as to anyone from outside. So I'm in the middle of a dialogue with the work.
And it's also the moment when you tell your story, because until then it was mostly framed by others who were writing about the uprising. No?
Yes, and so, but it's funny when you say that, and I immediately see this cover, which was the hardest thing for me, to see Nicaragua and my name as if they were in any way equal. It was absurd, and something I had no control over, of course. Mm-hmm. But, you know, it's very hard to talk about, you know, the photographs, how they played, the role they played in capturing fragments of history and being fragmented further by the media and the way they use them. So one of the first things I did was come out, and this is an installation from 1982, where you see the pages in the book in the middle row, and the framed photograph in that middle row was an image that was already being collected, either by an individual or a museum. And I wanted you to see this tension between what is being seen by different audiences. So below is the photographs from which I'm making a selection for the book, and above are the photographs that are being published internationally, large, small. That's the Geo magazine you were referring to, with the green frame around it. And you know, the installation was called Mediation. It was really important to understand I am seeing myself and the work being seen, and how to reconcile that.
And maybe I can say something here, because I find this really important and interesting. You know, Martha Rosler, she wrote a very critical review of your book when it came out.
Yeah.
And I found that most interesting because, you know, it was one of the first photojournalist books that were in color. That was also one of the things that was problematic, because, you know, black and white was associated with truth and with this kind of neutral, you know, with truth speaking. Yes, and so yours was in color, which was already, you know, intense. And then everybody remembered still, you know, Walker Evans, you know, a pronouncement that color is in some way vulgar, and that you need a lot of effort to kind of work with that. And he said this in 76 or 77 or something like that. So it was really recent. And then you put these people in those colorful foulard, you know, on the cover, and this is what Martha Rosler reacted to. And she was very critical of documentary photography, because her argument, which she later formulated, was that, you know, when you are a documentary photographer, your name always comes in the end comes to kind of obliterate the topic that you speak about. And then she used this phrase that a revolution is not a fashion show in that review, which she all took back a couple of years later. And I think what is important in this story is that it's never about the picture itself. I mean, you can never understand the meaning of a gesture, of a photograph, from the picture itself, from the style it is in, or whatever we project into it. And it's always about the context, about how you work with these pictures, how you create a narrative with them. And this is why I wanted to say this here, because I mean, this is why at least to me, I mean, your work has been so exemplary. Is that you didn't stop. I mean, you did, as you just said. You followed the revolution. How it developed. It was also quickly over, and it was hailed as the kind of first successful revolution in that context and at that time. So everybody was happy. So you could have just published the book and be celebrated as the only Western journalist who actually covered that thing, and be done with it, and just but you did not. And I think that this is the really important moment, So on the one hand, there are people who say, well, the pictures, they don't show the real revolution. They just show it as a kind of, fashionable thing with young people shooting with guns on the streets. But then, it has had an impact, and you go back to it and you try to show, how it was received, how you worked on these images, how you contextualize them, and how others contextualize them. And that is something that has never happened before, to such an extent.
Yeah.
So where did this come from?
Gosh, Chris, you just touched on so many different things. I mean, I want to go back to this image because that's what you're referring to that Martha was critical of. It was as if, and even in the way you expressed it, and I know you're nominally bilingual, but I didn't pose these guys. I didn't dress them
of course you
as
didn't.
if it were a fashion show. They're performing themselves. And actually, I think, from my own experience, I have often said, Martha at that time was so critical and had tremendous prominence, and I was just beginning to work. It could have completely crushed me. And I often say it's the revolution that kept me going. And I think that's, it's important because, the power of that language was so decisive in her mind, and condemning. I think what you're talking about is the problematizing that came from the practice. It wasn't a theoretical position, it wasn't a conceptual decision, it was just from my gut. And so I think what you see is me living through these images, learning from these images. When I go back for the first anniversary, what was on the New York Times cover becomes a tourist poster for the town of Messiah. So they reclaim. I'm not having to repatriate, they're reclaiming. So who owns the history? This is, again, from that first anniversary in which Matchbox covers of the Molotov Man and the Christian revolutionaries, because he's wearing a cross, claim him. So I'm tracing the value of those images. You don't know that they'll have historical resonance. I'm tracking as best I can when I encounter the Molotov Man in a different town than where he threw the Molotov. He's painted in with all the legends of Nicaragua. And then I'm beginning to also see how the images are distorted through the media, right? So this magazine cover, which is now, I think, it's 83, and the Revolution Betrayed. So as you say, in 79, July 79, it was a year of insurrection. It was unpredictable that they were going to win. No one believed in Latin America after Cuba there would be another revolution. I was going back and forth between Nicaragua and El Salvador was another 12 years, and it was a peace negotiation. It wasn't a triumph. But already the U.S. media is determining how it should be seen. You know, I've often looked at this and said they didn't even put a question mark, you know. It was declared. So as I'm tracing what's happening to the media context of positioning, I'm also seeing the Molotov man evolve. And he's used as an icon on the left where his no pasaran, you know, which is from the Spanish Civil War, but the idea that they're mobilizing a popular militia to fight the Contra. And on the right side, someone sends me, this is a Xerox from the Contra raising funds to fight the Sandinistas. So I become very, I mean, what can I do except to understand what is happening or document what is happening to the Molotov man.
And could you say maybe a little bit more about, you know, what pushed you on that you know, trajectory? I mean, what made you just, you know, come back to that and look at that?
There it is, you know. I'm going in and out of Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, parts of Latin America. I spend a decade traveling, and I'm discovering him. No one's calling me up and said, do you mind if I use this photograph to paint on the wall? You know, I mean, neither did Banksy, by the way. You know, I mean, it's discovering and tracing and trying to, so this is the important image in relation to the painting, which I think you can see slightly the figure. So after 10 years, the Sandinistas have an election, and I come back to find the people in my photographs. I make a film called Pictures from Revolution. And this wall becomes very important to me because they're painting out the Molotov man.
And there was a typo, it's Messiah.
Oh, did you? I didn't watch what you wrote. So Pictures from Revolution, I think, is a different set of questions. It's not only what's happened to the revolution within the 10 years, but how did the people in the photographs feel about the time they lived and what has happened to the hopes and aspirations they had. So what you see on the left is I'm turning, if you see the film, which I think we didn't play the clip, but you see me turning the pages of the book, looking for people, going back to the place where I made the photograph to ask people, do you have any idea who he is, where he might be today?
And how did that project start? I mean, it was also in the context of you starting a job teaching journalism at Harvard, no?
Yeah, I did do it. I did it with two colleagues from Harvard.
From Harvard, no?
I just was obsessed about going in and out through Central America for that 10-year period, wondering how were people feeling about history moving on. Essentially, they had survived the Contra War. There had been a negotiation. There had been an election. And then what? I mean, we could be doing it today, here or in my country. Yeah. Right? What will be? What will come? How do we feel? We're living history. So it was really trying to, I think we're going to show you a clip of, this is the Molotov man when I finally encounter him, if it works. Yeah. Oh.
Soy famoso por eso. Tal vez no solo en Nicaragua, internacionalmente, y me siento tranquilo, dichoso. En realidad siempre me he mantenido al margen de la revolución, pero sigo siendo sandinista y venga el régimen quien venga, mi conciencia es sandinista hasta la muerte, pues. Yo pienso que así como yo con mi padre a mí nunca me dijo ser revolucionario. Y sin embargo, yo fui revolucionario. Y yo creo que eso ya viene en la sangre. Viene en la sangre. No es necesario de que te la digan.
So how, the important idea that comes not just from photographs that are taken and brought back to Nicaragua and placed back in time, in various punctured, that's my photograph at the time of the triumph of the revolution. I mean, the plaza is not full, but it's a remembrance, which I discover on the 25th anniversary. The 25th anniversary of the revolution brought me to discover again the Molotov Man coming back home, the monument built in his hometown. He's already been where he's on the t-shirts at the 20th anniversary. He's the symbol on the 25th anniversary. This is all coming from just my going back. Mm-hmm. So each July 19th up through the 25th, 30th, I would go back to see what I could see about what was happening in Nicaragua. I think that the 25th anniversary becomes something different in the sense that I want to bring the photographs back to understand what photographs mean to people in the history, many of whom haven't lived that history. So there's one thing about being in the photograph, being in history. There's something else about how we look at these photographs over time and understand time through those photographs. So that becomes another kind of process of inquiry.
And maybe this is the time to kind of raise this one aspect that we talked about when when we're discussing what we could talk about today. And I had this idea to make this distinction that most photographers work in a temporary mode, you know, journalists. They go to a place, they photograph it, you know, they send in the pictures, and then that's it, and they go back. And your mode is temporal in the sense that you decide to stay and you decide to come back. And that is something that is really, you know, that it makes a huge difference, yes, in your practice, and this is why your practice has been so exemplary for many other photographers later on. And, you know, and I think this is also a very good example because, you know, coming back to Martha Rosler's, you know, critical assessment of documentary photographic practice, I mean, this is a way to bring it back to life. In a way, because I mean, it's not that it's the fault of the photographers. This is how the kind of photographic world works. That, you know, these things, they are important at some point, and then they get assimilated to our photography world or the journalist world, and they become a kind of historical object. So everybody, you know, who is interested in photography, I mean, I think everybody will happen upon Nicaragua, the book, you know, and then learn about it in a kind of historical context. That, you know, there was Walker Evans, and then there was, you know, other people, and then there was Susan Meiselas, who did this, you know, amazing book. But you kind of refuse to let these pictures become just historical artifacts, because the gesture of taking them out of your archive and bringing them back to Nicaragua on the 25th anniversary, and then, you know, producing this situation where the people can look at themselves sometimes, or at their, you know, parents, uncles, you know, family members from 25 years ago, and look at, you know, what has happened a quarter century earlier. That's quite something. I mean,
well, then how do you keep, I mean, this project really comes from digitizing my archive at this time. So this is now 2004. I'm beginning to digitize my archive, and the question is, what are these pictures for? Who are they for? So one set of them go to what was known as the Institute of History in Managua. I say what is known because I'm not sure it still exists due to the circumstances that we're living now. And that's when I get the idea, well, I want to bring them back. And with the Institute of History in Managua, I say, what do you think? Does it make sense to bring these pictures back and find out what they mean to people today? So, the kind of the then and now is a construct that we use in photography, but giving voice. I don't think I included a clip of this, but it becomes very important. It's a film called Reframing History, which is inviting people simply to comment on what they're seeing. So there are no headshots talking. You just hear the voices of what they think they remember. I think the only, each of these are in a different location. I think I was very symbolic. I chose 19 because the revolution was July 19th, the triumph. But I think this is the next context that we're going to show. This is the Nicaragua book. with something called Look and Listen, an app that I developed so that you would get a feeling of the still photograph and the life within it.
Yo me vengo dando cuenta de la realidad de nosotros los pobres, con un gobierno que defiende los intereses capitalistas. De allí es cuando nosotros nace esa conciencia de luchar por los pobres, que somos pobres, pero nosotros luchamos por aquellos que todavía no se deciden. Entonces, pues, el carácter personal mío, eso me impulsó a dar ese paso de sumarme a la lucha.
So that's another sense of the temporality. So trying to disrupt the frozen frame of the so-called iconic photograph, be it that it was on the New York Times cover or not, it's to invite a different response, to provoke as you turn a page, and it's not every page, but I cut up the film Pictures from Revolution, which was 90 minutes, into short clips, and actually the new edition is coming out it was just coming out in at Periphoto with QR codes because it's more familiar, but it's disruptive because we want to see the photograph. The photograph was then, and we don't necessarily want to know what's happened to him now, right? And so I'm looking for means by which the photograph lives in time, and we recognize this is also, I'm living in time, they're living in time.
So
and the time of the photograph is constantly there to reference as we go on.
Yeah, so you keep redrawing that frame. And in this way, these photographs, they kind of stay alive. They don't become monuments of a bygone era, but they are kind of still alive in this sense, no?
Yeah.
And it's quite extraordinary that we can look at these pictures, after 25, 30 years again, and they still resonate, with these events, with the history, and also with the experience of the people who participated in that. And here you go.
Here's the next stage of it, because here's somebody on the 40th anniversary, so 2018, I'm being sent via Facebook my photograph, which they've seen on my website with the notes from the making of the Pictures from Revolution, and an activist in 2018 protesting against President Ortega, who was Sandinista. And I'm being sent that, wondering, well, do I go? There are plenty of eyes on Nicaragua from within Nicaragua now. At a time, I'm experiencing this place through their eyes. I do go, and I go because I need to understand. I can't understand just seeing the pictures coming in via Facebook. And I discover the Molotov Man now on the T-shirts of the university students rebelling against the Sandinista president. So neither does the Molotov Man own the image of what happens to him and who he goes on, kind of mobilizing. So that's, I think, ending here is partly because Nicaragua isn't on the media map anymore. It's closed down. It's in my memory. It's in my feeling. But there's sort of two things that start to happen where the photographs have one kind of life. The people who are resisting, as you just saw, have a different kind of life. They're forced to leave Nicaragua. They're in exile. So there's a fragmentation again of information. And I don't know how to, where does it lead us, to, it's strange because when I was in Periphoto last week, I went to a salon where they had piles and piles of photographs, not the ones that are beautifully in the little booths of contemporary artists, but just piles and piles of photographs in a, kind of like a flea market. So how do we make images that have meaning, ongoing meaning for us is something that I continue to ponder. It's not an answer, it's a series of questions. to make the images, to make the context for the images, to, as you say, keep images alive, not just in our individual memories, personal memories, and yet, how do we do that? You know, books, films, public space, the Instagram, you know.
Especially now that there's so many of them.
And there's so many. How many billion are being uploaded every day? So where do we place ourselves? What do we do with what we make? I think these are just ongoing questions.
Yeah, and I think that's what your practice shows is that it's not in the images as objects, but it's in their relationality. It's in, you know, what kind of relationships we can build with them and how they can activate, you know, and be reactivated in a certain context.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I have one more question. I mean, okay, once you are immersed in such a context, how do you let go, or when do you let go, or
You
what's...
assume I have.
Do you?
I don't know.
Yeah.
That is the last I was in Nicaragua. And that's July 2018. So it's a long time ago. Now it's quite difficult for me to go. So actually I did an exhibition for the 40th anniversary, and I curated the work from Nicaragua of Nicaraguans. It was coming to me. This was actually pre-Instagram when I think about it. I don't know. And that felt exactly right. That felt like the right match at the time. So I don't feel like I'm letting it go. The question is it when might be a time to return in a different way? And that's an open question.
Yeah, so it's always an open question.
I hope you can, how much can you keep it open is the question, you know, it's also, where do you go? How long do you stay? When do you return? How do you know how long it's living within you? And we'll find another expression.
And so there's one more thing about this whole temporal aspect. It's the temporality of the photograph itself. I mean, in the sense, when we look at the history of photography, it's always this kind of, you know, very localized thing. We have this moment, this moment, this moment, and they become important because they become iconic, you know. And so what happens with your projects is that it's not about a moment in time or in history, but it becomes about a span, about, you know, like 25 years suddenly. So when we look at Nicaragua, it's not about this picture in Managua or this picture about the training camp or about the impact they have had at the time when they were taken, but they become a kind of a portal to a certain reality that we can maybe better understand. And that is something that doesn't happen too often with photographs, because, you know, all too often they become identified with a very specific moment in time, and then also restricted to it. No?
Yeah, constrained by that time.
Yeah.
Rather than an invitation to think about time. I mean, where do we go from there? I think we wanted to talk about others that create archives. So this was an exploration of an archive in one sense of one part of my archive, but where we're heading towards is talking about archival practices more broadly.
Yes, and about how others have also employed this kind of temporal engagement with photography and through photography with a certain reality. But also that when you try to show the contemporary world, well, it is never localized. It's always embedded in much wider contexts. I mean, always has been, but it becomes much more important today. And so the first example that we talked about when we started kind of thinking what we could show as a kind of context for your work, or or also work that is kind of related in the sense of analogy of thinking or of practice, is Negative Publicity by photographer Edmund Clark and investigative journalist Crofton Black. And they spent 5 years trying to trace the practice and the sites of what the Bush administration called extraordinary. Well, you did not, clearly.
Yeah.
So what the Bush administration called extraordinary rendition as a part of the so-called war on terror, and as a part of which many people were abducted from different places of the world without due process and held in so-called black sites in different places of the world, also here in Poland. And of course, none of them were officially confirmed, but this investigation goes to great lengths to kind of really pinpoint them and name them and show where they were. And well, two of them, one of them is in Poland, the other one is just outside of Vilnius in Lithuania. So we have some of them really close by. And their way of working is, how do you show places that officially do not exist? Or, how do you photograph stuff that we know is there, but we don't know where it is? Or how do we approach them? And it took them a couple of years to get there. So the publication, the book that came out of the project, it shows documents. It doesn't show only pictures. The pictures are contextualized by the documents, and the documents are sometimes quite extensive.
They're actually created through the documentation, because it's the documents that lead them to the sites, or information that leads Edmund to find the sites.
Yes.
So they look almost anonymous, a forest, but it's actually coming right from the index in the document. So I think that's interesting also. My practice was looking at from the photographs and into the photographs. He's making photographs in response to the text,
the paper trail.
Yeah, the paper trail.
So it's like it's like an inverse relationship.
Yeah.
You started with the reality that you photographed to later kind of come to understand it and contextualize it in your work.
Yeah.
And they started with a very complicated investigation.
Well, and also
to be able to show something.
I was contextualizing through the voices of those who participated. Here you've got the evidence through the documentation, so it's not. It's a very cold reading of what they did, that they decode, deconstruct, and then reimagine through the sites that Edmund documents.
But
That's
they also
a reverse process.
Yes, but they also talked to people who were abducted.
Yeah.
And who went through that experience, and this was also partly how they found part of the places, that hotel in Macedonia and other places. So here you have, for example, a heavily redacted CIA document that shows special interrogation techniques. So as you can see, threats, smoke, stress positions, and waterboarding techniques are actually not redacted out. So what is? It goes quite farther than that. So that's the seat of the military in Kabul. And of course, the way they show it is they show you first documents and then photographs and then a kind of footnotes to these elements, so that first we can read through them ourselves, try to connect them, and then they give you more information on how they are all interconnected. And each chapter finishes with a picture from the house of a person who has been abducted as a part of extraordinary rendition. So it always ends with a kind of personal note and the personal space of the people who try to make a new life after that experience. And the other one, which is maybe closer to your work, is Antoinette de Jong and Robert Knott's Poppy, Trails of Afghan Heroin. So Robert is the photojournalist, Antoinette is the writer, and they started off in the early 90s with a series of assignments in and around Afghanistan, which was about the civil war. And in that process, they realized that there's much more to the topic. And they spent, in the end, 20 years in that region, documenting it, publishing about it. And what came out on the other end of that time of immersion in that context, which they also did not let go of, is this book, which is like 500 pages long, multimedia installation, 4-channel projection with photographs, and an interactive documentary piece, which is many hours of video inside, which they did with Dutch curator Iris Seeking. And it doesn't work, unfortunately. I wanted to show you a fragment of that piece, but somehow it's broken. So I hope they will be able to fix it, because the videos, they don't work anymore. That's a big problem with interactive documentaries, that the technology changes so quickly that you put a lot of work into doing something, and you bring it out, and then after a couple of years, it's hard to see it. But what they actually try to show is the impact of Afghanistan as a kind of point of conflict on the whole world, because 90% of the world production of opium is in Afghanistan. It's a $50 billion business, and the routes over which the heroin is, or the opium is being transported to the West, so-called West, is actually, this is the trails of international conflicts. So it's along these routes that armed conflicts arise, especially so when these trading routes are endangered. So they have traced 3 routes over the Balkans, over the former Soviet republics. Tajikistan is a very important place, and the southern route. So it has become a very elaborate story on international drug trade, but how it is connected with armed conflicts, and that in many respects armed conflicts are deeply connected to this network, which generates, well, huge income for many parties involved, and from which many people and organizations and institutions profit, but not the people who live in those places.
But part of showing this in our conversation was trying to think about people doing the practice as the practice is evolving. Where does one go as a documentary photographer? How the form develops, how far it can be. I mean, obviously the people in Afghanistan aren't seeing the book.
No.
In that particular context, it's constrained, though it had a very big life in this interactive space, but was a European context.
It was.
Yeah.
But it was an attempt at showing a larger picture. So they have been publishing this as news stories or as, reportages in different places. But then they realized that there's a much bigger story to it, and they decided to put a lot of effort into putting this together as a kind of narrative. But
I was thinking about how we see this work, and then, of course, our lives, our images of the Taliban and what's happened since this project cover over so much of the depth of this work, which is kind of extraordinary. It was a completely independent production,
Yes.
As was Edmund's. And they're very difficult to do, to produce, to have that kind of persistence, to believe when we go back to what do you believe you're doing and who is it for and who will it impact and what kind of a life can be interrupted through it. I don't know. It's really, really important. I mean, I don't know how many practitioners are in the room or curators are in the room or historians are in the room, but the scale of these projects is significant.
And they're also both of them are grassroots projects, in the sense that they were not commissioned and they were not funded.
Yeah, they're motivated by passion and persistence and obsession and
like yours.
Yeah.
And it also reminded me of a commentary on that work by Jörg Kohlberg, who is whom many people who are photographers know, of course, because he's an important writer about photography, especially about photo books. And he, when this book came out, he wrote a short piece on his blog about meeting Robert Knott, and recalling that he was amazed at why did this guy come to me? Because it was clearly like a portfolio review of something, and he came with this work to him, and he wanted to talk to him about doing this book, and it was like a photography festival, yes. So it was mostly people who were doing something that we would call rather art than reportage, and Kohlberg, he was amazed at why does he try to kind of come to this kind of art context and produce something like that, where he has been and he's shown this work, but maybe this is the only way where you can find a space to kind of produce that kind of work or find funding for it. Some of them are self-funded. What we could also bring in here, which we did not, is the Sochi project by Rob Hornstra and who's the writer? Yes, but what's his name? I'm blanking out. I will remember. Which is also amazing because it was also like a grassroots project. It was huge, realized over many years, which was initiated, over this whole idea of doing the Olympic Games in Sochi, with Russia being this kind of trying to be the superpower again. And the two authors, they wanted to kind of look closely at that and see how it develops over the years. And it was funded by the audience, by people who wanted to see more of that work, and they were buying small publications that they did in the meantime, and this is how they funded their subsequent trips and research, etc., until it became something like a huge Phaidon book, an exhibition that went all around the world, also an interactive project, very beautiful one, and I would say that this is the same kind of dynamic.
Yeah, no, well, I was just thinking back, somehow the title of our encounter today is Why War?
Yeah.
And that takes us a little far off, why, how can we not look at war? How do we look at war? What do we do while we're looking at war? That's also embedded in our daily lives now in a very different way than these projects. Interesting. I mean, having seen them in process, where I've seen them, in many cases I've seen them as books and not the full interactive exhibition. And I have some ambivalence about books give you this feeling of integrity, of as much as you could imagine you can place, and just releasing Nicaragua again, it's this, another layer of history that I can embed in the book, but it's very limited in relation to the world that we're living in, unable to interact with, not knowing what to do about what we know, all of these much more difficult questions. And I can't help but think about them here, partly because we're in a museum and what museums do. I think the Brown exhibition, and I think it's an extraordinary body of work under very different kinds of conditions here. What will this work mean in time to the people from which it came, which is one question, yeah, we have lots of work to do still.
But it's a very interesting question that you raise, because why war is also, why do we look at war, or why do we want to look at war? Because in many respects, what is around that is more important than looking at the so-called action itself. We had a little bit of discussion during the last meeting in this series about that. That what the world wants is the pictures of the action itself, in the front lines and the trenches and everything. But in many respects, to understand what it's all about, we have to look around it, and to look at the Sochi project is in many ways about war, about this whole region which is conflict-ridden, and whole ethnic groups bleeding out, in endless wars. And then there's this huge Olympic Games that everybody looks at, but nobody sees what is going on around it. And in many ways, these Olympic Games were a huge fig leaf, not to look at that context, to kind of reprogram that whole, situation. And so when these are also very important gestures, I would say, because they are about the war, but they try to tell us that we shouldn't always look only, just looking at the carnage doesn't make us understand anything. And it's also a question of responsibility. So, for example, in the pictures that are shown here, it's also a little bit of a different perspective. It's somebody who's part of that and who's trying to show to the world what's happening so that the world knows. But when somebody from outside comes, now this is also a question of who is the photographer today? Because, when you went to Nicaragua, you kind of made it possible for the world to see what was happening there. Yeah. Because you had the connections, yes? Right now, the dynamic looks a little bit different.
Totally different.
Yeah.
No, I think there were Nicaraguan photographers then, and I worked alongside many of them in Nicaragua and El Salvador. The difference was, it was the North, the Europeans in the North looking at the South. That's completely a reverse dynamic now. Yes, there were Western photographers, non-European, perhaps, in the Ukraine as well, but we were also seeing the work of Ukrainian photographers. So the regional eye was different. They're lasting, they're staying, they're living through the wars, and people are coming and going. If you look at what's happened in the last year with Gaza, we're not seeing anything other than the view from within. And it's a very different perspective. It's very powerful because it's very intimate, and they're using a different technology. The iPhone really has changed, and we didn't experience it that way. I didn't, at least, in terms of the Ukrainian war. That was still within a traditional construct, I would say.
Yes, really?
As an American.
Yeah, okay.
As an American, I was reading still in the media.
That's interesting because our perspective here was quite different, because we had immediately a flood of pictures done by people on the ground, through social media, and one of the main channels by which these images came here was Telegram and TikTok.
Right. But there was a mix.
Yes.
You had media and social media. And
Yes.
what we've had in the last year is only social media, I think.
Yeah.
From Gaza. You really don't, maybe in Ukraine you're seeing another perspective. But I've really been struck by how many people I was following in order to know what was happening. That was a very different experience than I had with the Ukraine. Yeah. Maybe it was different for you all following. You see what I'm saying? So I was never interested in people following me per se, be it in Nicaragua or anywhere else. But that was the only means by which we could know what was happening in Gaza in the last year.
Yeah, and that is a deep shift that has occurred, no?
Yeah.
In the age of the networked image. And maybe we have touched upon something that is very contemporary now. And it also changes the way, how professional photographers, would, situate themselves. How do you see that? What has changed?
That becomes the question. What are you contributing? What is,
what
not only what's your perspective, what are you bringing? What are you, how are you collaborating? And that's an interesting word now. We did this book with Ariella and a number, 5 of us, collaboration, A Potential History of Photography, and it was trying to open up this question of it is not just the auteur who makes the event of photography, etc. It's still a very potent word, so potent that the French publisher wouldn't use it on the front, on the cover of the book. It's what more do we do, and how do we do it together? And actually, I think Strike is a good example of that. The work that Rafal and Milach and many others participated together which is a very particular model that comes right from here. That's another grassroots model. So we're looking at, different, or are we? I mean, what are we trying to draw out from this? Different conditions, different kinds of responses, constantly trying to innovate and be more inclusive.
Yeah, but what Rafa has been doing here, together with this group of Archive of Public Protests, it's also something very local, in the sense that it's a local community of photographers, practitioners who have, in a systematic way, documented what's been going on here in Poland. And what do you think the role of a professional photographer in an international context can be right now? You know what I mean? That, somebody from Magnum, goes to Ukraine now. What would be the...
Gosh,
what can such a person do? Or what,
I don't think you can ask that question abstractly. I think it's who is that person who goes, and what does it mean to them to be there, and what do they bring, and when I say what do they contribute, I think that becomes the central question. So the media in so many ways is broken for independent photographers. I mean, the way I was able to work was not to be on assignment, but reproduction fees would pay for my next ticket and my next roll of film, and it was a fluid system, completely broken today. You can't, I think, it was striking at Paris Photo. There must have been 500 books around the Grand Palais, or something like that. Is bookmaking all that we can do? Is that enough? So how else can we make meaningful interventions and, and bring people together through photography?
And do you think that this kind of temporal engagement could be one of the ways? I mean, it's getting also harder and harder because, because of the lack of funding and the lack of institutional support, it's kind of near to impossible for a photographer to go somewhere for a long time. No, I mean, unless it's self-funded. So that's a big obstacle. But then on the other hand, the way of working most of the time is, to get yourself a fixer, go somewhere, go to places, take the pictures, and go out. And that's not a privileged position anymore, because, I mean, apart from, being a professional who delivers good pictures, yes, all the time, it's not that you give a really different perspective from people who are there and who work, from the context. And maybe that is that's a huge challenge to think through right now, no? To think about the place of photographers.
Yeah, I'm trying to free associate to exemplary work that's being done from that kind of position. Or I'm thinking about the time where, there are many shifts we haven't talked about within my own questioning, I would say. So Nicaragua has one kind of a history that I shared, but when I start to work in El Salvador, we make a book called Work of 30 Photographers over a 4-year period, and it's not about my work, it's about our work. And yet, it was too risky for the regional photographers from Salvador to be in that book. They were at greater risk. So what are we doing on behalf as a collective action, right? In the case of the work I do in Kurdistan, it's really not about the professional photographer. It's about the photograph as evidence, cultural evidence, in a sense, made by, it could have been a missionary, an anthropologist, a traveler of any kind, all of which are making a contribution to this place in time and understanding a people that have no national archive, have no, kind of centering, no homeland to store their history as you all do, which is extraordinary. The city was destroyed and the museum is still here, and has the objects of time within it. So that's a privilege.
So yet we landed in Kurdistan.
Oh, yeah. We said we wouldn't talk about Kurdistan.
Yes, I'm very happy that we did, actually. I mean, at least a little bit.
No, but what I'm
Because-
trying to raise is the question of how do you find a strategy that is appropriate to a particular place and the role that you might invent. You know, it's not what it has been. It has to be something that we can't yet imagine.
I have a working theory.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've been trying to pitch it like part by part, but that it's not about the pictures per se, but about relationships, about relationality. And I think this is why the book that you did is so great, the collaboration, the collaborators, because it's all about relationality, and it's all about what Ariela says about photography, the political ontology of photography, that all it does is establish relationships, and that it's not just an image that is a referent of something, but it's the inscription of a relationship. And if we see that, then maybe, this kind of working in a specific context, even if you come from outside, if you're able to establish that kind of relationship, then it starts to become something more, something else, not just like an outsider's perspective. This is why, for example, I love your Kurdistan work, because it's also something like that. You arrived with a forensic, archaeologist to document, crimes against humanity in Kurdistan. And then you stayed there, to produce something that is kind of the first history of the Kurdish people, like internationally available, yes? And it's not like you came there with this project, no?
No, I think that's kind of, maybe that's what maybe we're heading towards, is how do you respond to a set of conditions and opportunities and create the opportunity that feels appropriate. That's really what we're talking about. And I don't think you just take from one to place it in another. You might have ideas from others, but it comes from the organic relationship, as you say, the relationship, the network, the sense of necessity. What's at risk? What has to happen? And what can you do? I think with Kurdistan, I didn't go with the concept. But the minute I began to see the difference between, and this is back to temporality, I'm photographing the exhumations of mass graves that I've read about, and that's something that I know from my work in Latin America, so that's a very comfortable, in a way, transition, or understood by me. What shifts is when I realize the contemporary imaging of exhumations doesn't explain in any way why people were being killed. So it's not enough to photograph an exhumed body. It has to be, so why? The why. And so how do you begin to open up and strip away to create why were the Kurds such a threat in the region that they were inhabiting? So that was held in the eyes of many others beyond myself. So I'm in a timeline of image makers, I'm insignificant compared to 100 years of history, really. It's just a dot on a historical map, So it leads, I'm led on the trail, like looking for little breadcrumbs, Little Red Riding Hood. I sort of thought of myself almost in that way, it was dangerous to be a Kurd. Why a photograph of a Kurd was dangerous to keep, which, as a suppressed history, only propelled me more.
And now we have also talked about what we were hoping to talk about, is how do these perspectives arise? Like, how do you recognize something like that? That you just don't go with, a clearly specified aim beforehand, and you just execute and then you go back.
Yeah.
But you kind of keep your perception and your mind open to what is happening, and then you realize that there is something more there. I mean, this is how most of your work until now has kind of worked, no? That you go somewhere, and then a project of 20 years comes up, and then but you have to recognize it somehow, that that you really want to do it, and that it's something worth doing. Like here also, that they started something and they could have just finished, but then they were like connecting, as you said, connecting the dots, the breadcrumbs, and then suddenly it came together as something more. and maybe it was before, because they were from outside, that they could see it, because these things were not familiar.
Yeah, yeah. I do think sometimes, but I don't think it's always true, that you have to be from the outside to see the inside, or from an inside see it more deeply than an outsider can. I think we have to be careful about that. But staying open to your own process and interacting with others is definitely part of what we're talking about.
This picture makes me think of Kurdistan, of your exhibition, because it also had this kind of title.
This mapping.
With a
well,
map.
The Kurdistan project goes on when it gets installed, because every time I install it, I look for the community of Kurds that might be around the museum. And they add stories to what I call a story map now. But that's a gesture towards acknowledging, right, how partial whatever we bring together is in relation to the vast possibilities. You're creating, again, the possibility of an ongoing dialogue.
And that's also something that you tried to do in the late 90s when the project first, when you first published the project in the digital sphere, where you opened a site, aka Kurdistan, where you invited the Kurdish diaspora to contribute pictures and stories to your research, so that it doesn't belong to you, but that it becomes a part of that community. And I found that a really beautiful gesture. At the same time, the world was not ready for it yet, because it was before Web 2.0.
Exactly.
And,
exactly.
It didn't exactly pan out.
It wasn't. It was actually a fight against the fixed object of a book. That a book makes it seem like it's done, and it's it. It's the authority of those pages, those very 400 and whatever pages. And then you realize history moves on, so you have to have something that's more responsive. So this word reacting to time and responding to time and responding to new ideas, the beauty of that project was each time we moved it, we scanned the photographs that people brought to the museum. So they came to the museum to see the photographs that had been collected, and they brought with them things that weren't yet known. So again, it's like a circle of inclusion.
So again, reframing.
Maybe that's
and
a perfect segue to our audience.
Exactly.
A circle of inclusion.
Yes, that's kind of a key word now, no? So we would like to invite you to ask questions if you have some, and I hope people online who are watching us right now, they also have questions, because I will be able to respond to them. I mean, but Susan, but they will be relayed to me if there are some. So please know that you can ask questions online too, and we will see them if they come up.
But we can't see the people who might be asking the questions.
No, we will. If somebody wants to ask something, we will.
Thank you very much, and sorry for these telephones. I have one question to you. You told about the past was much easier for us photographers to do the story and to be engaged with the story who takes time. And what kind of quotation, credo, you would like to deliver to young people who would like to be photographers, make pictures? And what is this message for these young photographers from you today?
Well, I think I was trying to say, we all have to find the meaning of what it is when you, it goes back to this idea of relationship. What is your relationship to the world around you? What are you trying to know or understand or commit to or explore, or what's the depth of that motivation? So I think probably too often before, we filled in what others wanted from us at times. And I think the now you see a different process, of self-questioning as who are you, where you are, what are you offering, what are you contributing. These are a different set of questions than I think people were asking 30, 40 years ago. So, of course, you could work for a small newspaper and have a very meaningful relationship today in that very specific place. There's no singular answer, I think, to that query. But if it's why are you there? Is it to be a photographer, or is it? You see what I'm saying? It's not the position of the photographer. It's the question of who you are, and again,
what do you want to say?
What do you want to say in response to what you come to know?
I mean,
very often I think photographers have been assumed that they have to know in order to respond. And actually it's slightly different. I felt that discomfort, that I'm supposed to know something because I've been somewhere. But if I haven't been somewhere, I'm not sure I do know anything, if you follow.
You know what? It's Willem Flusser, the philosopher, he had this idea that in the age of the technical image, photography is actually a way of doing philosophy, of questioning reality. And I think that, the way you approach your subjects is a way of doing that, because it's a way of questioning. It's not like, you show us this is how it was, this is the reality, because you are actually what am I actually photographing? How is it being used? How is it being recontextualized? Is it really set in stone? What has changed since I last took that picture? So you never allow these pictures to congeal into something, done and fixed. And something that you just said before also kind of triggered this when you said I did this website because I wanted to kind of, counteract the finitude of the book. Yeah. That the book is something, and you also reacted to these huge volumes that I showed here in this kind of, way that that's maybe a bit problematic, because they just seem to close that relationship to the world, whereas there is a way to kind of keep this alive, by the gestures of contextualizing. So in a way, you use photography in a very performative way. It's it's not like you took them once and then they're in an archive, but you kind of come back to them, you reuse them, and that is something that is quite extraordinary, I would say. So that is a way of rather questioning than answering or showing.
It's so counter to what we think, though, a photograph is, because we think a photograph has a frame, and the frame has a finality to it, even though we know we've stolen that frame in a way from the flow of life. So we're bringing it back to life by opening it up.
But look, in a way, it's like how to say that? It's like a prefiguration of how how the photograph works today, in the sense that Witek, who's sitting here, Orski, and myself, we did this project with our students when the war broke out. We looked at how pictures of the war circulated in the digital sphere. We think about pictures today as networked images, yes? And what does that mean? That there is no original, there's not one picture that is the real thing, and then there are copies, there are only copies, and there are many of them, and that there's not one that is authorized. They are all kind of reused, reposted, recontextualized, used as memes, etc., etc. And paradoxically, the pictures that have had the biggest impact are the ones that have been used as memes, and so rewritten, cropped, with text added and reposted, ad infinitum. So in a sense, this kind of, this fluidity of the meaning also, yes, is extraordinary. And there was this one work by Julia Jarko. She used that picture from Azovstal. Thank you very much. With the soldier with this beam of light that was all over the place, and she showed how it was reposted and reframed by tens of Instagram accounts around the world in different contexts, including Korea. Yes, and so she kind of tried to trace that image, how it moved, become an icon, yes, but also how its movements. So how it is a dynamic thing, how it's not like a fixed, because this whole idea of an iconic image, yes, is something totally counter to that. That it's like this one image that we all recognize. But in a way, this is also something that you show, that in a way, iconic images are images that are being reused and reframed. I mean, much more. I mean, maybe not iconic images, but images that have some kind of agency.
Yeah, I mean, the Molotov Man becomes iconic, but beyond the imagination of what he can stand for. So I don't know. In collaboration, we reference one of the projects from Ukraine, which were photographs being sent out to those who didn't know what was happening within, who had just left, and it was a kind of almost like a postcard. So I think we're living in a time where there's such density and saturation. To what extent they touch us is going to still be the biggest question. How do they move us? How do we know what we're seeing, which is going to be the big question with AI, the veracity, as you talk about it earlier. How do we allow ourselves to experience them in new ways? Can we experience them in new ways? Or those of us who make them, can we find, which is the answer in a way to your question. I'm hoping the next generation imagines using photography in a way that I haven't. It's a visual language that's constantly innovating. Well, where does what you have to say come from?
That's not an easy question. Yes. Did questions arise in the meantime while we were talking about agency in photography?
First, I want to say thank you for your great work about Kurdistan, because I made a film for 3 years about Kurdish refugees, and your work helped me really a lot to understand about these people. It was very inspired, but I want to ask. I think I try to find some voices of Kurdish journalists, photographers, about their problems, about the genocide, and I think their own voices are so silent. It's very difficult to find Kurdish people which speak about themselves. We know from Palestine, from Israel, from Ukraine, from Belarus, but I try to find their voices, Kurdish people, and it's very difficult. What do you think, why it's so?
I'm in diaspora. I don't think it's so difficult. I think it's extremely difficult in certain parts of Kurdistan, particularly Turkey. So it's to have that expectation, maybe. But I don't find that that's difficult when people are where they feel safe. So I don't know. I don't know if there's a Kurdish community here in Poland. I know there's a huge community in Germany and France and Spain and Italy, but I actually don't know about Poland. But I don't find that that's where they feel they can't speak and express or write or make fantastic art and film and all sorts of expression. Yeah, no. When I do these workshops, the workshop is really a very modest contribution. You know, it's asking someone if there's a memory of their homeland that they want to share with an unknown stranger, because the idea is that we put up little books that other people take and read and respond to. So it's, you know, you have to want to tell a story to someone you don't know. And that opens up a different kind of dialogue. Maybe they feel protected in that space. They don't, you know, maybe it's a more anonymous act in some way than an interview, which is very direct. I don't know what your methods were, but you follow what I'm saying? Yeah. It's interesting, when we were doing Reframing History, it was really important to not film people, speaking. In other words, have their voices. They were more comfortable with audio than they were being in sync sound. So I think different conditions, you have to think about what is someone able to feel comfortable doing.
Was it a question of security for them?
Yeah, I think so. Being heard by others.
Especially with the fragile political situation in Nicaragua. So
yeah.
I
mean,
can
we
imagine
were
that
doing this before the intensity of what happened after 2018. It would be almost impossible to do today.
Even then, people didn't feel safe, yes, to speak out, in front of the camera, showing their faces.
I think we felt that we were getting richer exchanges without having to work in sync. And that's, most of the work I did with carnival strippers was never in sync. I was capturing sound right from the beginning of managers and clients and women, interactions. People felt very free with audio. So audio is... So this question of, how you approach what it is you're gathering, how people understand what you're going to do with it, any number of things can shift.
It's great that you brought it up, because this is also another way to kind of expand the frame of the picture, to add context. You have a picture that can be strong, that can be evocative, but then when you have an audio that adds the perspective of one of the protagonists.
And actually, it was the first work of carnival strippers was on the walls with free sound floating, and so it disrupted your direct relationship to what you're seeing, to be hearing something quite distinct. So it retriangulates. It just opens other ways of experiencing the work.
Like you did with the new edition of Nicaragua with the QR codes, where you can have, those are more directly tethered to the pictures, but still they kind of expand the frame of the
I
of
like
the specific
this
frames.
expanding the frame.
Do we have any more questions to our guest?
Have we put you to sleep?
Hopefully not. I was actually planning to show one more work, so maybe I'll show you 3 pictures, which is a colleague, Paweł Starzec, and it's also a work of not being able to kind of let go of something, and it's investigative, and I actually made a small video of an interactive project that didn't work because the video is broken. So again, the interactive part didn't work, but what he did is he took a European document that is called the Final Report of the Commission of Experts established pursuant to Security Council Resolution 780 from 1992, Annex 8, Camps and International Criminal Tribunal for the Former Yugoslavia Indictments, which is a document that sums up all the atrocities, all the transgressions of human rights that have occurred during the Balkan Wars and in the former Yugoslavia. And he went to Bosnia and Herzegovina, and he tried to find, it took him 8 years, he tried to find the specific places where the camps were. And it is, in this respect, it's very interesting that this outsider position was crucial, because the camps are in places that are inhabited by the perpetrators. So it's kind of impossible in many places which he visited. So there's only one picture where there is like a small monument, which is, I think, this picture. I'm not sure, but I think there's one, like a small inscription. But most of the pictures are just nondescript buildings, very often abandoned ones, or like schools, sports facilities. And so the strength of this piece, for example, is to make visible something that has been made invisible and that we have been reminded of. For example, I mean, there was this moment when everybody was talking about this, and it was a very present thing in our thinking and everyday experience in Europe. Yes, and Michael Haneke, when he was doing his Eiszeit trilogy, he would put pictures from the wars in every of his movies. You would like see those, like they would be there on the TV screens, in Benny's video and the other ones. And so Paweł, when I asked him why he did this piece, it's like, how can we not remember that it happened just at our doorsteps, and there was just, you know, an anniversary, and nobody even wrote about it. Yes, and it's something so fresh and still not healed. If you go to Sarajevo, you still see the scars of the war in the city. And he's been attending the series of conferences which are called Why Remember, the Why Remember conferences. They were co-organized by Paul Lowe, who just recently tragically died, a photographer from the UK, a documentary photographer. And they also ask this question, which is very interesting in these conferences, that do we really have to remember everything? So that's kind of the other side of that story, that our culture is all about remembering and bringing something forward. But then on the other hand, there's this question of what do we need to forget to be able to live on? Or what do we need to forget to be able to kind of, you know, build something new? Can we do that without losing something important? Or can we do that without repeating, you know, all the atrocities that we have already, you know, committed?
Well, that's quite a question.
Yeah.
I think from Warsaw. I think, you know, I'm acutely aware of how little I know, having not been here and not been exposed to the layers of history that you've lived through, that I've only in a secondary and tertiary way been exposed to. So, you know, I think how much we can hold dear, you know. I think this notion of the media map, losing sight of places or intentionally not looking at places, shouldn't be what determines our gaze, you know. We have to find ways to look beyond what the frame that we're given.
That's maybe a good cue to finish our conversation. Look beyond the frame that we're given. I like that.
I want to say thank you first, and then I want to say that when you brought Paweł Starzyc's project and you kept repeating we. So the question is, who are we, of course, but maybe responding to the previous question about the role of photographer, because you brought Paweł to this conversation, I think this, and also in relation to your practice, photographer as a witness. So we can forget, but there is this one persistent witness who keeps on returning to the site of the event, to the site of violence, and showing it yet again and yet again and yet again, and making sense of it. Because in your Nicaragua project, what you're, in my opinion, what you're actually doing, you're weaving the texture of memory. And post-memory, when you're showing the images to the children, and there are kids of these people, like with the Molotov man, and it's very, very important in my reading of this project that there's a kid saying, okay, this memory is going to be carried on. And because of these images, and these images are going to be part of how these people are going to carry the memory of these events. So I think the word witness was not brought into this conversation, so I wanted to bring it here, because I think a witness is someone who's making sense of the events, right, and keeps on talking. Otherwise, she's not a witness.
Well, talking or showing, which, you know, is why I'm so moved being in Warsaw for the last day and a half, you know, partly what we saw together yesterday, what I saw in the museum today, the documents that believed in just the evidence of life lived, shared at the time of their making and the living, and hoping that that will be passed on, which is, you know, we know the limits of that, not stopping the war that we see every day. You know, this kind of, the choice to have a kind of consciousness beyond your own experience in life is work, the work of living.
Brought up one more thing.
Witness.
Witness and archive. I mean, you said archive, but then, you know, both the Kurdistan project and Nicaragua also, I mean, in the end, you did not talk about it. When the Prensa building was bombed and their archives burned down, you know, this is also the moment when you became involved.
Well, it's the moment that I brought back the photographs that had been made by others and taken away, and understood the power of they own their own, they should own their own history. So I brought the photographs from others back to the Institute. The irony of that is that initially they were in the Museum of Revolution for multiple years until the Contra-War. So 3-4 years later, the Sandinistas buried the history to protect it. So it's not visible anymore. So it's not like having the museum here right in the Central Plaza and looking at the devastated Warsaw as you are at the bottom floor. You can never forget that image when you then go out the next day to see the city. So if the evidence is buried, so I think your point is it's not just the ongoing telling and the showing and creating new environments for the work to have ongoing life.
And then you have
The archive is just the beginning place to further invest. There's always more there, and there's a lot missing. And what's so amazing about the show that I saw earlier with Braun and discovering the woman that was the hidden woman who was in the frame, but of course whether or not the frames that she made are hers is still a question, but nonetheless there you have, a discovery, an ongoing discovery. And it's, there's so much that the archive holds, but still to be discovered.
It's another place for a witness. I mean, somebody who kind of takes these things out and makes them visible again, no?
Yeah.
So it's another form of witnessing. But you have to
Yes.
have this kind of, I mean, it's good to have an archive like that you can go back to. Because if it's really, not there, then sometimes there's nothing from which you can draw, yes? So both the Prensa archive, you bringing the pictures back, as for the Kurds, taking, bringing those pictures together and those family stories that people could recognize that this is our history, and this is, that we are one, so to say, which was impossible without, putting all of these stories and these pictures together, as a kind of texture of memory, yes? Because it was only there as oral history in the specific clans, yes? And then, taking them out to be told and to be shown and to be seen. So that's, again, this thing.
I like this idea of the archivist and the curator as a witness. Because it's always upon the maker to be the witness, to document, to capture. But in fact, it's the way we weave through the archive to make it more visible. And that's an activist as well, not just a witness.
Absolutely.
But this is like Family of Men title.
How is it like Family of Men?
Excuse me?
How is it like a Family of Men?
No, this is a history, He made the exhibition which touched everybody.
That's a big subject as
Yes,
to whether or
yes,
not the Family of
I-
Man touched everyone. It had a certain philosophy of life, that's for sure.
I'm afraid that we don't have time to open this
We don't.
discussion about Family of Men, sorry.
It's interesting that it came up, though, during our discussion,
sure.
because it had a very strong impact here in Poland when it was shown. Yeah, but that is for like a huge discussion.
It is.
And we
It
have like
is.
3 minutes left.
But if
so-
you do go to Luxembourg, you should see it reinstalled, because that's an extraordinary experience. There's where you really see it operating and how it operated and what it tried to communicate and how it worked on all the various societies where it was placed.
6 years.
Yeah, so yes, thank you for everyone for coming.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Susan.
Chris.